Hello there, and welcome to the first of the Crime Studies Network podcasts, online seminars, whatever you want to call them. I'm not quite sure if my offering meets the conventions of a proper podcast, but here we are. So I am Dr. Louise Wattis, and I am a senior lecturer in criminology at Teesside University in the northeast of England. And I have an interest in issues around gender, violence against women, women's experiences of victimisation, offending, and more recently I've become increasingly interested in popular criminology and, its use and its value within academic criminology. Hence what I'm going to talk about today, which is an example of that. So I'm basically going to talk about gender and true crime. Gender and true crime, masculinity, femininity and true crime, and as I've mentioned, kind of the potential value of true crime for the academic criminologist. So what I'm going to do first is talk a bit about the appeal of true crime for female audiences. A lot has been made of this within media, commentaries, think pieces, and also academic work, highlighting the fact that, true crime is far more popular with women, and, coming up with a set of explanations as to why that might be the case. But I interrogate that a bit and highlight, it's when we look at true crime and how varied it is and the subgenres of true crime, then men as consumers come into view. So that the latter part of the presentation will explore what type of true crime men like and what the appeal might be and what the appeal of that particular type of true crime might be for male audiences. But all will be revealed as the presentation progresses. First, I will start with a definition of true crime, which we probably all think we know what it is, but it's kind of useful to start with, a clear definition of what we're working with here. And it's one of those things as well, when I'm put on the spot, I can't come up with what I feel is a satisfactory definition of true crime. But this is basically stories, narratives across a range of formats that deal with actual events. Greg and Wilson put it better than me, I feel. True crime stories offer heightened, narrativized versions of historical crime events, actual crime events, things that have actually happened. As I mentioned, this is across a range of formats. There's a history of the true crime magazine, true crime books, those lower quality TV documentaries that, dealt with macabre, grisly crimes. And a lot of the time it was about these reconstructions of particular crimes that had been solved. Obviously, more recently, we get the more kind of the true crime documentaries across a serialized format where audiences are invited to kind of think about, truth and the facts of a particular case and are essentially jurified, as Bruzzi puts it. And these deal with issues around the kind of flaws within the justice system, that type of thing. Making a Murderer, the staircase would be the, standouts in regard to that particular genre of true crime. And obviously we now have the true crime podcasts, which have become quite the phenomena. And I think one of the key things about true crime is that it is based on fact, but often will embellish facts and play with the truth in its construction of crime stories. So Mark Seltzer, talks about true crime as crime fact, which looks like fiction, as having its own weather. So these are real life events that are altered, embellished, and it's this kind of, hits on that blurring of the boundaries between fact and fiction, the real and the mediated. So alongside other forms of popular criminology, other types of text, true crime, is of interest and use within academic criminology. I mean, it's not without its issues, you know, in terms of things like distorting perceptions of violent crime, perpetrators and victims, you know, kind of certain genres, kind of the way that they would present the criminal justice system and policing in it kind of an overly positive light, you know, as much more effective and successful than they actually are. And obviously there are clear ethical issues attached to true crime in regards to the fact that it deals with the real suffering of real people. You know, which leads to the question that Jean Murley asks about why is there such an easy acceptance of murder as entertainment, but that there are a number of ways that kind of true crime can be used by academics, not just academic criminologists, but I'm a criminologist, so that's where I'm coming from, and that's what I'm kind of getting at today in, you know, what I'm exploring. So to start with then, just to think about this kind of, you know, this interest in women as true crime audiences and readers, and you know, which has led to quite a lot. If you do a Google search, you will get lots and lots of articles, and you know, from, you know, kind of highbrow broadsheet newspapers, The Guardian, New York Times, The New Yorker, which just what it is about true crime that appeals to women so much. And Woman's Hour, if you know, the kind of the flagship BBC Radio 4 programme, you know, ran a special podcast on kind of getting to grips with and getting to the bottom of women's interest in true crime. And, you know, there's a number of kind of explanations that have been offered for the appeal of true crime amongst female audiences. And I suppose it would be useful for me to give you some statistics. Well, these vary. You know, kind of 70–80% of kind of audiences and readers of true crime and crime fiction are women. And for podcasts, this is even higher. 80–85% of audiences are women. So what are the reasons that are given for this appeal of true crime amongst women? Fraley and Vickery, who are evolutionary psychologists, talk about women read true crime as a means of picking up kind of survival tactics and escape cues that they might be able to use in kind of real life if they find themselves in potentially risky and dangerous situations. Others argue that it is a way for women to engage vicariously with fear, risk and violence in a society that actively encourages women to fear and feel at risk. This is a safe space in which to engage with violence, fear and risk. Other explanations talk about the way in which women want to understand motivation and the psyche of the killer and to solve the puzzle. But, you know, just to kind of flag this up at this point, you know, equally could men not kind of, you know, maybe not all of those explanations, but certainly want to understand the puzzle and the motivation of the killer. So that's kind of a roundup of what is offered in regard to, you know, why true crime is so popular with women. So then, just to kind of continue this discussion of gender and true crime, female audiences and true crime. True crime is now essentially a cultural mainstay within contemporary mediascapes, and mainly as a result of technological transformation, you know, that the emergence of streaming platforms and the female podcast phenomena, and which has really changed the way that we consume our kind of mediated violence, our cultural violence. We can now binge watch, we can now curate our engagement with mediated crime and violence. And there is essentially as well something unique about the podcast format, and Greer puts this very well. Podcasting allows for the portability of broadcasts, the ability to play these recordings whenever, wherever and on multiple devices. This portable Podcasting personability has led to a more intimate listening experience. Using earbuds, users often hear podcasters' voices directly in their ears as they walk to school, drive to work, or make dinner at home. Which again, maybe it's the intimacy of the experience, which could also be an additional kind of means of understanding why it appeals to women. And a significant kind of, feature of the podcast phenomena is the female-led true crime podcast, which, probably the most popular, well-known, successful one would be My Favourite Murder, presented by comedians Karen Kilgariff and Georgia Hardstark. But you've got, there have been a number of copycats of this particular format where women get together, have a laugh. Sometimes there are men involved, but it's generally a kind of, this is a female-led phenomena. And you've got the kind of the UK version, All Killer No Filler, which again, is presented by two comedians who don't just talk about crime, gory crime, but their personal lives. They have a laugh, they go right off on tangents, and very similar to My Favourite Murder. In terms of the true crime that they feature, it is very much murder event, as Jean Murley puts it, true crime. So it would be the retelling of a series of murders, often involving female victims, often involving serial killers. But these podcasts, and especially My Favourite Murder, probably, as I mentioned, it is the most popular and well-known one. Certainly it would be within the US, but I think there's a huge following in this country as well. This combines, these retelling of cases with, disclosures around mental health, trauma, and really calls forth this kind of community of women who make up their audience. They even have this name, the Murderinos, for the women who listen. And then there's the catchphrase, the tagline, "Stay sexy, don't get murdered." So it's very much about this kind of community of women. That the presenters call them forth. They build up this rapport with women, and research bears out the popularity of this particular podcast amongst women. Gall and Myrick did some research on the mental health benefits that listeners get from being involved, listening to My Favourite Murder, but being involved within that community. And it was, their research was 98% are women who took part within that particular research, and they highlight how it's the intermediary aspect as well, the way in which women interact, audiences interact with the podcast, but also the social media side of things as well kind of really builds that sense of community and rapport. And this really reinforces the idea as well of true crime as therapy, which Laura Browder has written about, talking about, she kind of challenges the idea that true crime is anti-feminist in the way that women are represented and are often murder victims, to highlight how it can work as a means for women who've been through violence against women as it serves a therapeutic function. Megan Sweeney says something similar about kind of incarcerated women reading crime fiction in prison, how that can do the same thing and stands in for therapies. But this is what Laura Browder's saying here, and I would argue this is even more the case in regard to a podcast such as My Favourite Murder, which seems to really reach out to its largely female audience. So women read true crime to help themselves cope with the patriarchal violence they've encountered in the past and fear in the present. True crime allows women to gaze into the abyss, both of the terror suffered by crime victims and their own traumatic memories, and to survive. So really kind of reinforcing this idea of true crime as therapy. So you get the idea about, women as, or, as the majority audience, and there are reasons offered for this, which I hope I've covered effectively, but you know, that's not the whole story about true crime, and this is a particular type of true crime that we are dealing with when we think about women as, you know, the large majority of the audience. So I now want to move on then to talk about men and true crime. Right, so I now want to talk about men in true crime, and male audiences of true crime, and what type of true crime men would be into, which you can kind of guess what I'm going to talk about probably from the slides. Just to start though, just a caveat, just to say that I acknowledge the fact that, you know, talking about true crime or particular types of true crime as therapy for women, as a way of engaging with fear, and men and masculinity and liking to read about gangsters, you know, there is a risk of essentializing male and female audiences of true crime. At the same time, you know, for instance, Fisher's work on interpretive communities in regard to audiences based on identity or sharing an interest in a particular genre or shared background, commonalities, highlights that there is something in that, and we certainly cannot deny those figures for the popularity of true crime as murder event amongst female audiences. But just to move on from that now then, now I've said that now and I've felt I needed to. And to think about, yeah, if we think about different types of true crime, if we acknowledge the variety of genres which come under that true crime umbrella, all of those subgenres, you know, there is so much more in there than just, you know, stories about serial killers, you know, so prison memoirs, war stories, you know, stories of organised crime, narratives of organised crime, espionage, state crime, that there is a lot going on that would essentially count as true crime. For me today, I'm going to focus on a particular subgenre, which I feel would be, and I've got some kind of tentative evidence that shows, you know, this type of true crime is popular with men. This is the type of true crime that men are interested in. You know, they come into view when we acknowledge the variety within true crime. And this is the kind of the stories, the memoirs, the biographies, the autobiographies of violent subjects linked to organised crime, you know, the figure of the gangster. They will often write their own stories as autobiography. Obviously, there are other stories written by biographies written by others. And Andrea Mayer, you know, there's not a lot of academic work on this, but Andrea Mayer is an exception, and she has written about the autobiographies of Mark Reed, the Australian criminal, who's known as Chopper, and there are films, you know, there are films about him as well as the books that he's written. And she talks about this type of individual, this type of subject, this type of violent subject as the unrepentant hard man or unrepentant hard men, and borrows from Ruth Penfold Mounce in talking about the underworld exhibitionist. And they will often chronicle the exploits of these guys and their involvement in organised crime, violent exploits, etc. And you know, and there is a kind of certain way that they will cast themselves in a positive light. Mayer talks about the way in which Reed self-mythologizes, you know, presents himself as a Robin Hood character with a code of honour, only kind of attacking people and sometimes killing them if they deserved it. In regard to, you know, links to criminology, you know, this resonates with narrative criminology, which focuses on the way in which offenders will construct stories about themselves, often in a way that, you know, that as a self story that will kind of justify their actions and present them in a positive light. So we see that within just, you know, within research, which explores the stories of offenders and across to these autobiographies. of violent subjects as well. So this is, so you've got these kind of stories of gangsters, some really well known, some renowned. The most well known would be, the Krays probably, but people like Mad Frankie Fraser and Charlie Richardson. And often you get these notorious kind of unrepentant hard men who are well known and very notorious, but there are others who stay within the parameters of the local imaginary, and more about that in a few slides' time. So just to give you a bit more of a taste of what the hard man biography or autobiography looks like and what it would contain, here is an extract from the back matter of Mad Frank's diary. Mad Frankie Fraser, who was an enforcer for and a notorious criminal gangster for the notorious Richardson gang, who were the rivals of the Kray twins. But Mad Frankie Fraser has become a household name, known to millions as one of London's most notorious gangsters. His stories of his life have become the stuff of legend, and Mad Frank's diary delves into areas he has never chosen or never dared to talk about before. Taking the form of a diary, the book chronicles Frank's memories from each day of the year, recalling incidents from throughout Frank's colourful and eventful life in a way that makes his stories highly accessible and hugely entertaining. The colourful and eventful life involving murder and torture, extracting people's teeth with pliers. And it's interesting to kind of, there often these stories, these texts are very, very celebratory about their protagonists, the violent subjects that they deal with. Obviously, if they've written them themselves, this as an autobiography, that might be more the case. But in general, there is this kind of, celebratory tone to this type of text. And indeed, what I find, because if you think, before he died in 2014, Fraser courted the media and his status as celebrity hard, and he had this status as a celebrity hard man. He did gangland tours of London, participated in book launches, performed a one-man show, an evening with, and as I mentioned, held these guided tours of London. And I find this quite interesting that this has never been picked up before, but we've had so much kind of academic interest in the idea of the serial killer as celebrity, and why we're so fascinated with serial killers and what is their appeal, and why is some kind of quite identifiable across fact and fiction, but never the same attention given to this figure of the gangster, never the same, we haven't had the same academic analysis. And arguably, there are certain examples, such as Fraser, the Krays, who are even stronger examples of this idea of the violent subject as celebrity. He is part of kind of collective memory, the national culture. He's definitely within culture, and you could say the same for the Krays. They're not vilified and cast out. And Schmidt talks about that in regard to his contrast with, the terrorist other and the serial killer, that the serial killer is allowed to exist within the culture, the familiar face of violence and evil. And I would argue this is even more so the case with a character like Fraser, as I mentioned, spent 40 years in prison, convicted of murder, tortured people, but then he's kind of portrayed as this colourful and entertaining character. And given the kind of the issues around true crime, the ethical issues, there is no consideration of the victims and the violence that's been committed. Looking at the figure of the gangster and the way they are framed, they are treated, really brings these ethical issues into sharp focus. And this bit from Blacker, in a piece written about Fraser, it really gets at this kind of relationship that we have with these violent figures, these old school villains, who are, as Blacker puts it, treated with a strange amount of indulgence by the press and public, their public appearances playing to amused and well-heeled audiences in the West End. Blacker further remarks that their acts of extreme violence become removed from their affable celebrity personas, so they appear to be almost fictional. And again, kind of highlighting, you know, that kind of that blurring of the fact fiction divide, you know, across a mediatized culture in general, but you know, we really see that with true crime, and the way the kind of, you know, we almost sort of disavow, but we do disavow the violence perpetrated by these figures, by these characters, even more so than we do with the figure of the serial killer, perhaps. So just to wrap up then, I would like to draw your attention to a case study, a text of this type that I have used in my work. And, you know, as a criminologist, you know, kind of explored this text to see what value it has for academic criminology. So this is the biography, well, it's not really a biography, but I'll come to that in a moment, of a violent subject, you know, similar to what I've you know, discussed in previous slides. It's different because it's very much a text of a local nature, in that this isn't about a very, very notorious criminal, you know, like the Crays or, you know, Frankie Fraser, who I talked about on the previous slide, but a man, a very violent individual who was known within, you know, the local milieu. I hope I've pronounced that right. You know, I'm now feeling like I should just start again, but you know, I tried. In the northeast of England, in Middlesbrough and Teesside, in the late 80s and the early 90s. And so he's very much a well-known character, and the myth of this guy and his reputation for violence, his physique still lives on. People are still talking about him, you know, and we can see that in the fact that, you know, that this book has been written about him, The Whole of the Moon, and also another book, and there's been a documentary, there is a planned film. People still talk about this character, Lee Duffy, which is what he's called. So I used this first book that was written about him by author Jamie Boyle, who is also from Middlesbrough, Teesside in the northeast of England, just to kind of explore its criminological potential. So my interest was twofold. I wanted to explore the kind of attraction of certain genres of true crime, this type of true crime, for a male audience, and also kind of explore more widely what the criminological potential of this text and others offers criminology. And this text is not unique. You know, other people may be interested in, you know, different texts, different violent subjects, but this is the one I chose, given it's the local connection and my local interest in crime and place in my area, and I kind of actually remember this guy myself. So, you know, the book it's not a kind of conventional, well, it's not a conventional biography. It's not, the narrative isn't structured around his life story. There are bits of that in the introduction, and there is some reflection at the end. But the main body of the book is the chapters are made up of verbatim interviews with a short introduction at the beginning of each chapter from friends, neighbours, acquaintances, enemies, bystanders who witnessed Lee Duffy's violence within the nighttime economy in Middlesbrough in the late 80s and the early 90s. And mainly the book talks about this. It talks about, you know, his reputation for violence, his physique for violence, the catalogue of violent attacks he perpetrated against men who were part of the same violent subcultures, but also, you know, people who just got in the way, you know, and the sense is that he was a violent bully. It also talks about his taxing activities quite a lot, his involvement as a nightclub bouncer within the kind of territories, the doorman territories of the nighttime economy, in that post-industrial nighttime economy. Just to go back to taxing, this relates to stealing from low-level drug dealers, so taking from them drugs and money. And this is kind of, this was his subsistence. This is how he survived. This is how he lived. He made money and lived off these kind of taxing activities. So this is what the book looks at. And for me, it has criminological potential in regard to those two things that I wanted to focus on. So then, just to talk a bit about, I realise I'm a lot longer than I should be, so I'll try and kind of race through this last bit, as we all do in a conference paper often. Take ages on the first bit and then fly through the last bit, which is often maybe the most important bit. So to think about the appeal of true crime and this particular type of true crime for a male audience. I mentioned Fairley and Vickery at the a bit earlier in the presentation, and the way in which they had used Amazon reviews to kind of as a measure of kind of the popularity of true crime amongst female audiences. They also flagged up the fact that when men were interested in stories of violence, this was generally war stories or organised crime. So I did a bit of that. I went onto the Amazon site and looked at reviews for this particular book. I also used the book itself as a resource to kind of highlight the way in which, the appeal of violence for particular men, and also looked on various online forums that are concerned with kind of, violence in one way or another. For instance, there was a boxing website I looked at, a website that was loosely connected to Middlesbrough Football Club, but was more about the kind of the hooligan culture around that, to get a sense of the way in which, particular communities of men view violence and the appeal of violent texts for particular men. And this relates to this idea that I mentioned a bit earlier in the presentation, communities of interest, and the way in which this violence and the figure of the hard man appeals to a male audience. And this is predominantly it does contradict that idea that true crime is all about women and women make up the majority of audiences. As I've mentioned, when we look at this particular type of true crime, men as readers, audiences do come into view. And that is not to say women are not interested in this, particularly at the local level, because these local books, for want of a better way of putting it, one of the big appeals of them is that people recognise the names, the places within them. There were certainly women who were reviewing the book and had enjoyed the book, but the majority were men who made up the audience. And just to add to this is a really, it's about this attraction and the appeal of violence. Just a bit here from Mark Wood, who maintains in his analysis of online fight pages, even when the constitution of audiences and the complexity of motivation is noted, fight pages undeniably provide a resource for certain users to legitimate their attitudes towards violence, attitudes which, as I have explored, are often founded in harmful codes of masculinity. And we certainly see an element of that in the way that some men engage with these particular texts. What the book also highlighted, and I will talk about this in more detail on the next slide, is that, this elevation and veneration of violence in the wake of deindustrialisation. I'll elaborate a bit more on that on the next slide. And again, drawing on Mark Wood in his analysis of these online fight pages where people wanted to watch these videos of fights, he talks about how they affirmed either the value or commonplaceness of violence. And I think this was certainly, resonated with these particular texts and the interests in violence and violent texts and the way that people gathered online as well to talk about these things. And here's just an example of what I mean. This is a quote from the book, just expressing this admiration for Lee Duffy, the character that I mentioned, the violent, the subject of this book, this kind of admiration, and he talks about other books and other violent characters and links them to Lee Duffy as well, which is interesting. I've read a lot of books over the years, and Lee put me in mind of Big Frank Mitchell, who ran about with the craze. Everywhere we went, people were frightened of him. What Lee was capable of really oozed out of him in abundance. He was so powerful. Of course, with Lee, he didn't just have the physicality, he had the no fear factor. And there is, again, as I've mentioned earlier, this tone, this celebratory tone in regard to, you know, the violent subject, the body built for violence, his technique, that type of thing. So then on to the second thing I've been interested in reading this book. It's its value for academic criminology. In what it serves as a historical document in the way that a lot of the stories that are told within this book, recount and retell a particular time and place. That time and place being a particular point in the history of deindustrialisation in the northeast of England, and the consequences of that deindustrialisation and the decimation of, the working class labour market, the male working class labour market for working class men, and how the consequences of that in regard to the way in which violence became elevated, venerated, and also a means of it provided criminal opportunities, entrepreneurial opportunities, with the emergence of kind of club culture and criminal markets connected to recreational drug use, and none more so than for the men who were kind of these violent subjects. Not all men were running around and being really, really violent in these kind of marginal, deindustrialised, post-industrialised spaces, but these key violent characters stand out, and you would find them, in other areas. And there is a lot written about this in criminology, in the work of people like Anthony Ellis, Simon Winlaw, Hall and Winlaw, James Treadwell, the consequences for the working class masculine subject as a result of deindustrialisation and the way, and kind of the relationship to violence. So, so that this quote from Anthony Ellis's book, for those for whom violence is a way of life, local bars became something of a gladiatorial arena for them and their peers. He's talking about these kind of violent characters that he studied within his ethnography, where the possibility of violence was a thrilling yet mundane and accepted prospect within this social setting. And this reflects very, very well the stories that were told in The Hall of the Moon about these violent subcultures, violence as a way of life. And what we see here is the way in which this particular text serves as a very effective popular criminological companion to the academic criminology, which charts these shifts and transformations. And this is from a book review, which kind of highlights this idea of the book as a historical document. When Lee was about in the 80s, that was when Middlesbrough was the roughest place in the country. I've travelled all over England working away, and I've never seen anywhere as rough as Borough was in the 80s. So you're getting that, it's about the recent history of the place and its connection to violence and how that relates to deindustrialisation within the area, within that time. Also that, the book highlights the central figure of the nightclub doorman that I mentioned briefly on the previous slide, and this, it was a key violent figure, violent subject, the bouncer within this within the nascent nighttime economy. And there was this fighting over territories, and always that kind of fear that someone would come along and be harder than you, so they would take over, that type of thing. And it also charts the emergence of the rave and club culture. There are many references to drug taking, clubs, that type of thing. So it serves its purpose as a historical document in a number of ways. And as I mentioned just then, it acts as a popular criminological companion to this academic criminology that has dealt with this subject in a lot of depth, class, violence, masculinity, deindustrialisation. And this is an extract from Simon Winlaw's book Badfellas, which actually, in terms of it, when the research was done, he talks about it being circa the mid-90s. It's quite close to the time when Lee Duffy was was kind of operating in the late 80s into the early 90s. He was actually stabbed to death in 1991 by a kind of a violent rival who he goaded. There had actually also been 2 attempts on his life. He'd been shot twice because of his taxing activities. So I will just end with this quote from Simon Winlow's book, Bad Fellas, which is the, you know, dealing with the same issues, albeit the same themes, albeit in an academically rigorous way. But what I wanted to demonstrate is the value of texts like The Hole of the Moon for academic criminology and exploring the things that I've looked at in terms of the history of masculinity, deindustrialization, etc., and also exploring the appeal of true crime and certain types of true crime for a male audience. As the market imposes its influence on criminal activity, not all criminal stimuli are financial. A complex reasoning still exists, and violence as a means of status advancement still has relevance. The chance to gain financially from crime and violence is now available and is currently being grasped by a growing number of young males who have little interest in cultural continuity, communal belonging, or methodological application. What counts is the immediacy over one's own lived existence and the chance to live life as a party, which certainly emerged in regard to Lee Duffy's hedonistic drug taking, and the opportunity to attain and maintain relevant status goals and experience the illicit stimulation deviancy so often provides. So I shall leave it there, and I'm sorry I've run over quite a lot. I hope you enjoyed it. Bye.